Sup y'all, and welcome to Cities and Urban Land Use, Part 2. In this video, we're going to look at this essential question: how did cities develop and diffuse from their original hearths?
Now, at the time of Mesopotamia, it was very important that the location was someplace that was fertile, that was defensible, also was around navigable rivers, places like those. Now, the cities were protected by earthen walls, as you can see this computer rendition of which was in Mesopotamia a long time ago. Now, being as people walked from place to place, the poorest were found on the outskirts of town, and the richest were toward the center. These cities also served as religious centers. You can see temples, or ziggurats, which dominated the landscape, usually in the inner area, often built on mounds. Since space was a premium, you often saw narrow lanes in between the homes. And of course, there was no waste disposal, so garbage was dumped in the middle of the streets. And because of this, disease kept the populations pretty small. Usually at most you saw 10 to 15,000 people per city. Of course, at that time, that was a pretty large number. Of course, looking at another region, we move on to Greece, which had a worldwide impact in terms of its influence, and of course had a massive impact in Western Europe. Now, virtually every city had an acropolis, a Parthenon as you can see here, for example. So these, as well, were also religious centers. And the best structures were built on the high point of the city. You also would have an agora, in many cases, a market. These were public spaces that were designed in the lower point of a city, with steps usually going down towards the center. People did all kinds of things here. They debated, they lectured, they planned wars. That's where we get the term today, agoraphobia, which means the fear of open spaces. Of course, the opposite of claustrophobia. Even though they had some more modern-looking structures, you still had a lot of the people in not much of a better situation than you had in Mesopotamia. Many of the people were in poorer houses. And for the vast majority, there was no sanitation of any kind either. Of course, one major innovation that the Greeks did was the grid system. This was a much more organized way of facilitating transportation and movement within the city structure itself. It's hard to imagine modern cities today without the grid system. And then, of course, you have the Romans. Now, the Romans were not really inventors of a lot of great things, but certainly they took a lot of what the Greeks had done and improved on them. They had transportation networks that linked the urban places by road, by river, and by sea. They were able to move troops and merchants faster than any other civilization at that time. Like the Greeks, they also used a rectangular grid pattern. They also improved on other things, such as the agora going to a modern forum, or basically their market. And of course, they expanded from the Greek theater into the Colosseum. Now in this map, you can see the vast distribution of cities in the western provinces of the Roman Empire around circa 100 AD. And the collapse of Rome coincided with the disintegration of their urban system and their transportation networks. Now this graph will show you about the last 1,000 years in Europe by looking at relative temperatures and how they went up through the medieval optimum and down through the Little Ice Age and back up again into the modern era. Now the term Preindustrial Europe refers to the pre-industrial revolution. Of course, there were vast industries that did exist, just not the modern mechanized industries. But this medieval optimum was a time of warmer climate that expanded farmlands and aided Europe's recovery and the eventual defeat of the Moors. During this time, and of course before the European colonization in the 1500s, you have what was kind of referred to as an urban banana. This was a crescent-shaped urban zone across Eurasia, going from the Eastern empires from Japan, through the Koreas, through China, India, the other Islamic empires, and ultimately into Europe. Cities developed along the Silk Road, and many cities were located in the interior, not along the coasts, because that's where trade was, and that's where the money was, and that's where the cities were. Even in the 14th century, 80 to 90% of Europe's urban population was still inside the former borders of the Roman Empire. However, once the first Europeans explored and found an all-water route around Africa, as well as the discovery of the Americas, trade, and by extension, cities shifted toward the coast. Now these maritime mercantile cities came around when trade was disrupted because the original routes and centers of power that were along the Silk Road now began to be focused on the Atlantic, starting in the 1500s. So whereas earlier many of the larger cities were on the interior of Eurasia, now many of the big cities started to be established along the coastal ports. And the central square, where a lot of the trade was done, became the focus, became a new downtown for these cities. During the Mercantile era, the cities that thrived were embellished by wealthy merchant families who built ornate mansions, patronized the arts, participated in city governments, and supported the reconstruction of many city centers.
Now, the Little Ice Age, another era of colder and drier climate, brought on the second agricultural revolution, highlighted by innovations such as four-field crop rotation and improved selective breeding. Increased food production, coupled with the enclosure movement, meant fewer farmers were needed on the land.
The colder and drier climate forced farmers and peasants into the cities. And then around the middle of the 1700s came the second urban revolution. Now this was made possible by two major things. First of all, the second agricultural revolution, in which you had a massive improvement of food production and surplus, in which many of the population that was there in Europe went to the cities. And the true focus of the second urban revolution was based on the Industrial Revolution, in which you had more cities that were focused near their basic resources, like coal and iron ore. Starting in the United Kingdom, it spread to places like Belgium, the Netherlands, Germany, France, even into places like Italy, Austria-Hungary, and later into Russia. These were manufacturing cities that grew out of the Industrial Revolution and the Little Ice Age. They were focused on mushrooming populations that fed the factories with cheap labor, but led to the development of tenements, or low-class apartment complexes, often located just outside the central city. And with new technologies like railroads, these urban realms were connected in ways that were impossible previously. But of course, looking at the cityscapes as you see there, no automobiles were located in the early stages. The poor living and health conditions improved with government intervention, city planning, and laws such as zoning, in which city land was reserved specifically for residential, commercial, or industrial use. And finally, modern cities have developed out of today's transportation and road systems, which have allowed the dispersal of vast populations into the suburbs in many cases. But of course, that's another story.
Okay. Recent polls have shown a fifth of Americans can't locate the U.S. on a world map. Why do you think this is?
I personally believe that U.S. Americans are unable to do so because some people out there in our nation don't have maps, and I believe that our education, like such as in South Africa and the Iraq, everywhere like such as, and I believe that they should, our education over here in the U.S. should help the U.S. or should help South Africa and should help the Iraq and the Asian countries, so we will be able to build up our future for our children.
Thank you very much, South Carolina.
What you just said is one of the most insanely idiotic things I have ever heard. At no point in your rambling, incoherent response were you even close to anything that could be considered a rational thought. Everyone in this room is now dumber for having listened to it. I award you no points, and may God have mercy on your soul.